want you to imagine for a moment that you are not in a nice warm sanctuary this Christmas morning, but out in a snow-covered forest high in the Jura Mountains. You are walking through the crisp morning air, listening to the crunch of new snow under your feet, admiring the tall pines, when you stop and bend down and pick up a single pine cone. It fits nicely in your hand. You take off your glove so that you can feel it, the prickly points there on the palm of your hand. You notice how it's made, the hundreds of small overlapping scales all connected to that stalk at the center. And you start thinking about how this single small cone, totally unremarkable on the floor of a great forest, can actually point you to so many other things. It points to the fully grown trees overhead that generate scores of new cones like this each year. It points to the soil under your feet that even in the cold of winter is providing a hospitable home for all these trees around you with roots sunk deep into the ground. It points to the sun overhead that continues to supply energy and warmth that you can feel on your skin. It points to the cycle of life, to the fact that this cone in your hand has the makings of other trees like the ones towering over you. You realize that when you look at this small, ordinary thing that you might overlook on the ground, you are looking at much more. You are looking at a rich and beautiful story, bigger and brighter and broader than you would ever notice at a first glimpse. So I think the beginning of the Gospel of John means to do something a little bit like this. It means to wake us up to the immensity and the beauty of the story that we are living in. Except that with John, we are not looking at a pine cone, we're looking at Jesus. It is a very strange Christmas story in some ways, but it's what John has. No shepherds or stargazers or cattle in the stable, no Mary and Joseph, no baby even. But on Christmas Day, when we remember that child born to a couple of ordinary parents in a backwater town more than 2,000 years ago, John sets the scene in the largest possible context. John reminds us just what we are looking at when we are looking at the baby Jesus. Many believe these verses that we heard read by Maureen a few moments ago from the Gospel of John actually began as an early Christian hymn. So to help us hear them that way, we're going to sing our way through John's Christmas story with the help of one of the oldest carols that we know. It's not as old as the Gospel of John, but not so far actually. The text does go back to the 4th century. The name is Of Eternal Love Begotten, and you'll find it on page 9 in your bulletin. We're singing verse 1 together now.
Of eternal love begotten, ere the world began to be, he is Alpha and Omega, he the source, the ending be, of the things that are that have been, and that future years shall see, evermore and evermore.
They're beautiful words, aren't they? Eternal love, ere the worlds began to be. Alpha and Omega, the source, the ending, evermore and evermore. In the language of this ancient hymn, when we look at Jesus, we are looking at the eternal story of God's love. The Gospel of John would agree. In the beginning was the Word, John says, which of course sounds more than a little bit like the beginning of the book of Genesis. Before he tells us anything else about Jesus, his miracles or his teaching or his healing or his death and resurrection, John tells us that Jesus has always been an expression of God, has always been the Word spoken and sung by God, all the way back to the beginning. So if you listen to the creative words of God that brought life into existence, in all of its beauty and variety, you hear Jesus there. If you listen to the bold words of promise spoken to God's people, words of comfort and hope and joy, you hear Jesus there. If you listen to the strong words of the prophets calling the people to care for the poor and seek justice for the oppressed, you hear Jesus there. So Jesus wasn't a momentary idea of God's, according to John. God didn't think him up on a whim. No, Christ is the source and the ending of life. The child in the manger on Christmas points us to God's eternal story of love, stretching all the way back to the beginning and farther on than we can imagine, evermore and evermore. It's a lot to take in. So we sing again. Verse 2 this time.
All the Lord forever blessed, when the Virgin full of grace, by the Holy Ghost conceiving, for the Savior of our race, and the faith of world's Redeemer, first revealed his sacred face, evermore and evermore.
So the hymn started with the cosmos, and now we're in the manger. Now we are at Christmas morning with the mother and the child. Yet these two verses, about eternity and about one single moment, are describing one and the same God. When we look at Jesus, the hymn says, we are looking at God's eternal story breaking into our time. Again, John would agree with that. The Word has always been there, but what happens in the life of Jesus is something unique. God's eternal story takes shape in a single human life. God's love becomes one of us. In John's language, the Word became flesh. You might say that is the wildest claim that Christians make. We can forget just how wild it is, this idea that a single human life embodied the fullness of God. That an infant who was dependent on his parents for everything, like any human infant, who grew into a child and caught the flu from time to time, and scraped his knees and became an adolescent, and finally an adult, that a human being could embody God's eternal story is mind-blowing. But that's what John says, and that's what we sing. It means that if you want to know what God is like, you look at what Jesus was like. You look at the way he welcomed those on the margins, and made room for all at the table, and honored the meek and the grieving and the peacemakers. You look at the way that Jesus lived and died, full of grace and truth, and you trust that God is like that. At Christmas in particular, we remember the profound tenderness of God that Jesus points us to. The whole system of the universe turns on the sort of love we find in a helpless child, says Rowan Williams. It's totally counterintuitive. It's confounding and mysterious. And it's the gift of Christmas. We sing one more time, verse 3 now.
This is he who sings in old time, chanted of with one accord, whom the voices of the prophets promised in their faithful word. Now he shines the long expected. Let creation praise its Lord, evermore and evermore.
The hymn started with the limits of time and space. It zeroed in on the manger, and now it comes into the present. Now he shines. The long expected, go the words. The point is subtle but so important. When we look at the child in the manger, we are not only looking at God's wide story that broke into time a long time ago, once upon a time. We are looking at our story too. John doesn't say from about the year 0 until about the year 30, the light shone in the darkness. No. The light shines in the darkness, he writes, and the darkness has not overcome it. The story of God's everlasting love that entered the world in a decisive way in Jesus continues. It includes us. It lights our way. That means that amidst all the other stories out there that might seem to make a claim on us, hopeless stories and dead-end stories, and stories that say wealth and status are all that really matter, and stories that say you are bound by past mistakes, and stories that say new beginnings are not possible. Amidst all those other stories we know so well, the story that claims us is the story of love there at the beginning, and there at the end, and there in this moment, here and now. The narrator in Wendell Berry's novel, Hannah Coulter, says this in looking back on a particularly difficult time in her life. Sometimes, too, I could see that love is a great room with lots of doors where we are invited to knock and come in. Though it contains all the world, the sun, the moon, and the stars, it is so small as to be found in our hearts. Jesus shows us that the love that holds the whole universe is also at home in a human life, and in our lives too. It's a room with a lot of doors where we are invited to knock and come in. The last two verses of that centuries-old hymn are all praise, lavish and strong and including all of creation. And that feels right. When you gaze at the child born this day and start to glimpse the wideness of God's love, the beautiful, generous, spacious story that finds its fullness in him, what else is there to do but sing? And so we do, with the heights of heaven, with the angels and the earth and all its creatures. We welcome God's gift, and we sing for joy. Amen. We stand.